Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a 300-year period, 1450 to 1750, it completely reshaped the global map.
Absolutely. The rise of European maritime empires.
And our mission here is to understand how these empires were built and, maybe more importantly, the brutal economic and labor systems they absolutely depended on.
Right, yeah.
To really set the stage for the human cost, the sources start with this really chilling image. It's from an anonymous West African griot song. A griot is a sort of a traditional historian or storyteller.
A living library, in a way.
Exactly. And the song says, "You grow your peanuts and plenty millet. The king sets a hand on everything and says it is not yours anymore. In the deepest of your sleep, the king beats his drum and says, 'Wake up. You are not free anymore.'"
Wow. That just,
Yeah.
it immediately tells you this isn't a story about exploration. It's about extraction. It's about the shock of losing everything.
Mm.
And this whole system, it was really driven by these intense rivalries between European nations, political, religious, economic.
Mm.
They needed huge resources to fund their global ambitions.
And how they chased those ambitions really depended on where they were in the world. Our sources draw a really crucial distinction here.
A massive distinction. You have to see it in two different ways. In Asia and Africa, the European powers mostly set up these administered trading posts.
Right, so a lighter footprint.
A lighter footprint, exactly.
Mhm.
The goal was to trade European silver and gold for luxury goods that were already there, silk, spices. But in the Americas,
A completely different story.
completely, they went for full colonization, agriculture, resource extraction,
Hmm.
building entire economies based on precious metals and, well, these new and devastating labor systems.
So let's start with Africa. The sources point to Prince Henry the Navigator, who was funding expeditions along Africa's Atlantic coast in the late 15th century.
And that engagement created this really dangerous new dynamic.
How so?
Well, local African rulers started trading enslaved people to the Europeans, and in return, they got powerful European technology,
Gunpowder and cannons.
gunpowder and cannons. And that just gave them a huge military edge. It allowed coastal states like the Asante Empire or the Kingdom of the Congo to grow incredibly powerful and wealthy by, participating in the slave trade. They would often raid interior societies to get captives.
And at the same time, the Europeans were trying to force their way into the Indian Ocean trade,
Mm-hmm.
a network that had been running smoothly for centuries.
And that's where the Portuguese just bring the violence.
right?
I mean, traditional Indian Ocean trade, it was based on merchant fees, taxes, strong religious and ethnic ties. It worked.
And then Vasco da Gama shows up.
And Vasco da Gama shows up in 1498. He invades these key Swahili city-states, places like Kilwa and Mombasa. He uses heavily armed ships, builds fortresses, and just throws the whole region into what the sources call a devastating decline.
And they weren't just fighting local rulers, were they? They had to secure that dominance against other major powers.
That's a great point. They secured control through naval force, and it all sort of came to a head at the Battle of Diu in 1509. They defeated this massive coalition that included not just local Gujaratis, but also the Mamluks from Egypt, and get this, Portugal's European rival, Venice.
Venus. Why were they involved?
Because Venice was still profiting from the old Mediterranean spice route. It was a truly global fight for who controlled the trade.
So if we move further east, we see a totally different reaction, outright resistance that actually worked.
Yes, like in China with the Ming Dynasty. After they pushed out the Mongols, they swung really hard towards conservatism. They banned private foreign trade, limited the size of their ships, and even destroyed dockyards to limit outside influence.
And Japan took it to a whole other level.
The extreme, yeah. They tolerated Portuguese and Dutch traders for a bit, but then some Christians destroyed Buddhist shrines, and the government just banned Christianity in 1587.
And it got even stricter.
Oh, yeah. By the 1630s, they kicked out almost all foreigners, banned their own citizens from traveling, and only let a handful of Dutch merchants onto this tiny artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor. Total isolation.
But even with that resistance in East Asia, the rivalries in Europe just kept heating up.
They just moved the competition elsewhere. You had the British East India Company, Portugal and Goa, France and Pondicherry, all setting up these competing trading posts in India.
And this is where it all connects back to a global conflict.
Exactly. These weren't just little skirmishes. The 7 Years' War in the mid-18th century was fought on, 5 continents. Britain's victory drove France out of both India and Canada.
And this created the British Global Network.
It did. Those trading posts became these crucial nodes for globalization. And it all explains why they needed so much wealth from the Americas. They needed that silver to fund these massive, ever-expanding global wars.
Which is the perfect setup for the Americas. And here, the story just becomes one of outright conquest.
Backed by a demographic catastrophe, it's hard to even wrap your head around it.
The Aztec and Inca empires, we're talking 10 to 15 million people each, and their populations just plummeted from European diseases before the military defeat even happened.
It's staggering. It completely changes the nature of the conquest. Cortés, with help from indigenous groups the Aztecs had already conquered, overthrew them by 1521. He melted down their treasures and built Mexico City right on the ruins of Tenochtitlan.
And Pizarro's conquest of the Inca was it was so cynical.
Unbelievably so.
He captures the ruler, Atahualpa, tells him to fill a huge room with gold for ransom. Atahualpa does it.
He complies completely.
And Pizarro just kills him anyway in 1533. Was there any justification for that, or was it just about the gold?
I mean, the sources suggest wealth trumped everything. Politically, Spain and Portugal moved fast to formalize their claims with the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494.
Right, they literally drew a line on the map.
Drew a line down the globe. Spain got pretty much everything to the west, and Portugal got the lands to the east, which is how they got their claim to Brazil.
And economically, they were looking for gold, but it was silver that really changed everything.
Silver was the jackpot. The discovery of mercury to refine the ore made silver mining incredibly profitable. Two cities basically became synonymous with this wealth. Zacatecas in Mexico, and especially Potosi, way up in the Andes in Peru.
This massive extraction was all tied into the economic theory of the time, mercantilism.
Right, and mercantilism wasn't just, high tariffs and exporting more than you import. It was an extreme form of national economic control.
Its whole purpose was to strengthen the government back home.
Precisely. For Spain, the goal was simple. The colonies existed to supply as much gold and silver as possible. A percentage of that, the royal fifth, went straight to the crown to fund those global wars we were talking about.
So the colonies had to be these closed economic loops.
Exactly. Maximize the wealth flowing back to Spain. And that wealth generation depended completely on coerced labor.
To understand the suffering, we really need to break down the different labor systems they used.
That's a good way to look at it. The earliest systems the Spanish used were tied to the land. The encomienda system in the early 1500s was brutal.
How did it work?
Landowners, or encomenderos, could basically force indigenous people to work for just food and shelter.
Yeah.
Yes. It was a new kind of serfdom in the Americas.
And that evolved into the hacienda system.
Yeah, where huge land grants were given to conquistadors to grow wheat, sugar. All of it worked by coerced labor.
And then you have the adaptation of an existing system, the Incan Mida.
Correct. The mida was traditionally a labor obligation for public works, but the Spanish twisted it.
Twisted it how?
They turned it into this mandatory, incredibly dangerous forced labor system. Villages were compelled to send their men to work in the silver mines, like Potosi, for wages that were just completely inadequate. A death sentence, really.
At the same time, especially in North America, they were trying a contract-based system, indentured servitude.
Right, where Europeans would work for, say, 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage and room and board, mostly for labor-intensive crops like tobacco.
But the landowners didn't see them as ideal workers.
Not at all. They weren't used to the climate. Many died. And this is a critical part. If they survived, they became free.
So you constantly need new workers.
You're constantly having to replace your workforce.
Yeah.
It just wasn't a sustainable model for the kind of massive permanent agriculture they wanted to build.
And this unsustainability, plus the collapse of the indigenous populations, this leads us to the catastrophic shift.
To African labor and the establishment of chattel slavery.
So why Africans after 1450?
It was a convergence of just awful factors. Indigenous populations were decimated by disease. The ones who survived knew the territory they could escape. Land was plentiful, but labor, profitable, reliable labor, was desperately scarce. So African people were seen as the target because they were unfamiliar with the land, they had no social networks for protection, and they could be treated as a commodity to be imported forever.
The sources are clear that African rulers and leaders on the coast participated. They traded enslaved people, often prisoners of war, or people from the lower rungs of their own societies, for European goods.
Yes, though we have to acknowledge that not everyone went along with it. King Afonso of Congo. He initially allowed slave trading, but he very quickly realized the raids were just uncontrollable.
It was undermining his kingdom.
Completely. It was depopulating his kingdom, destroying his authority. His letters to the King of Portugal are just filled with panic and desperation.
And the journey itself, it was immense horror. Captives held in these holding pens, these barracoons, or slave castles like the one on Goree Island, before being crammed onto
So
ships.
the Middle Passage,
Yeah.
that journey was about 6 weeks, and the mortality rate is it's staggering. 10 to 15% of all captives died before they even reached the Americas.
10 to 15%. That number represents hundreds of thousands of lives just lost at sea. The ocean became a mass grave.
It did. And the distribution of those who survived changed the entire hemisphere. The Portuguese colonies got the largest share, around 39%,
Followed by the British West Indies and the Spanish colonies.
at about 18% each, yeah. And the demographic changes were profound. African home countries saw population decline for a century. In the Americas, slavery shattered family structures, created new social classes, and led to multiracial groups like mestizos and mulattoes.
We should quickly mention a counterpoint, the Indian Ocean slave trade.
Right. It was also a horrific system, peaked a bit later, but the roles were often different.
How so?
Slaves were more likely to be laborers in seaports, on ships, or as household servants. In Islamic communities, they sometimes had the chance to form communities and even had certain rights, like the right to marry. Not to justify it, but it was structurally different.
So, what does this all mean? Our deep dive shows these maritime empires were built on political rivalry and military force, but the engine, the core engine that fueled the whole thing, was this violent, constant search for labor. It created all these complex, overlapping systems of coercion.
Which brings us to a final question for you to really think about. We've looked at several types of labor serfdom: indentured servitude, the encomienda, the mida.
Right.
Now think specifically about chattel slavery. In what specific ways did that concept, where people were legally defined as property, as chattel, to be bought and sold forever, how did that permanently reshape the very definition of status and citizenship in the Americas, compared to places where labor was coerced, be still tied to land or to time?
That's the key difference.
That shift, defining human beings as purely disposable property, that's the final tragic innovation of these empires.